On the cold morning of December 16th, 1944, Field Marshal Walter Model stood at the headquarters of Army Group B, staring at a situation map. To his eyes, this was not a battlefield. It was a mathematical gamble with a near absolute probability of death. Outside, the Ardennes forest lay buried under thick fog and snow. To the Allies, this was the ghost front, a quiet sector where exhausted American units went to rest and green troops went to freeze. Allied commanders like Eisenhower and Bradley believed the terrain itself was an impenetrable fortress, a natural wall that no tank could breach in the dead of winter. But beneath that canopy of white, the Nazi war machine had pulled off a miracle of logistics and camouflage. A massive strike force had assembled in total silence. 200,000 men, nearly 2,000 artillery pieces, and almost 1,000 tanks. Among them were the Third Reich's most terrifying steel monsters, the 70-ton King Tigers and the elite SS Panzer divisions. To the outside observer, this looked like the resurrection of the Wehrmacht of 1940, a steel spear tip, ready to tear through the weak American line. Yet, Walter Model saw a different picture. He did not see strength, he saw hollowness. He knew that this victory on paper was concealing a fatal, invisible flaw, a trap that Hitler himself had set for his own army. In modern warfare, fuel is blood. A panzer division is not a collection of knights on iron horses. It is a beast of voracious consumption. A single Tiger tank devoured 5 gallons of fuel to move just 1 mile on good ground. In the mud and snow of the Ardennes, that consumption doubled. Hitler's plan, codenamed Watch on the Rhine, demanded that these armored columns advance non-stop for 96 hours to cross the Meuse River. To achieve this, the German army needed 5 million gallons of reserve fuel. The reality was a mathematical disaster. They had less than half of that amount. This was the genesis of the dry trap. The German High Command had built an entire offensive based on a parasitic assumption. They did not bring enough fuel to reach the finish line. Instead, they planned to steal it from the enemy. Imagine the madness of this strategy. Driving a Formula One car with a half-empty tank, with the only plan for finishing the race being the hope that your opponent's gas stations are open and unguarded. Veteran panzer commanders like Joachim Peiper were given a chilling order. Your fuel is on the other side of the line. They had to capture the massive American supply dumps at Stavelot and Liège. If the Americans burned those dumps, the offensive dies. If they retreated with the fuel, the offensive dies. Walter Model had tried to warn Hitler about this uncontrollable variable. He proposed a smaller encirclement, but Hitler, obsessed with past glories, demanded the big solution, a decisive strike all the way to Antwerp. And so, the German war machine started its engines, not on industrial power, but on a prayer. The only variable in their favor was the weather. A massive low-pressure system blanketed northern Europe, grounding the terrifying Allied tactical air power. The P-47 Thunderbolts, the tank killers of the sky, sat silent on airfields in England. The Germans believed the fog would shield them from American industrial power. They believed that without air cover, the superior Tiger tank would crush the Sherman. They were right about the tanks, but they were wrong about the system. At 0530 hours, the silence broke. 1,900 German guns opened fire simultaneously, shaking the earth like a seismic event. The pine forests turned into a rain of deadly shrapnel. On the other side, American soldiers in frozen foxholes faced total chaos, their communication lines severed. And then, from the white mist, the dark shapes emerged. The grinding of tracks on snow announced the return of the monsters. Hitler's final Blitzkrieg had begun, but so had the countdown of the dry trap. Every meter the tracks rolled forward was a drop of precious fuel burned, bringing them closer to the inevitable disaster of 0 gallons. The initial shockwave was absolute. The ghost front did not just buckle, it evaporated. The American 99th and 106th Infantry Divisions, formations consisting largely of untested teenagers, found themselves staring into the muzzle flashes of a veteran army. These young men had been told the war was practically over. Now, they were being overrun by the specters of 1,940 in what would become the largest mass surrender of U.S. troops in the European theater. Thousands of Americans threw down their rifles, not out of cowardice, but out of sheer, overwhelming obsolescence. They had no heavy weapons to stop a King Tiger, It was like trying to stop a locomotive with a pistol. But for the German planners, this tactical victory was already consuming the one resource they could not replace: time. The German timetable was drafted with the precision of a railway schedule, demanding breakthroughs by specific hours. But the Ardennes did not care for German schedules. The narrow, winding roads, icy and treacherous, turned the massive armored columns into a logistical nightmare. The sheer size of the Tiger tanks became their enemy. They blocked roads, crushed bridges, and churned the mud into an impassable slurry for the supply trucks trying to follow. Leading the spearhead of the 6th Panzer Army was Lieutenant Colonel Joachim Peiper. Peiper was the archetype of the fanatical SS commander, young, ruthless, and technically brilliant. His Kampfgruppe was the tip of the spear. His orders were explicit and suicidal. Ignore your flanks, ignore prisoners, ignore casualties. Drive west. Do not stop until you reach the Meuse. But Peiper knew the secret condition attached to his orders. He was driving a machine that was already dying of thirst. As Peiper's column smashed through the Lochheim Gap, the dashboard of his command vehicle told the grim story. The fuel needles were dropping faster than the kilometers were rising. The rough terrain was tripling their fuel consumption. The parasitic nature of the operation forced Peiper to behave not as a conqueror, but as a scavenger. He wasn't just looking for tactical weak points. He was hunting for jerry cans. Every tactical decision he made was now dictated by the fuel gauge. On the morning of December 17th, Peiper achieved the operation's first grim success of this parasitic strategy. His tanks rolled into the town of Bullingen. They didn't storm it for strategic ground. They stormed it for the logistical gold mine located at a small American supply depot. Here, for the first time, the dry trap was momentarily delayed. Peiper forced American POWs to refuel his Panthers and Tigers with captured Allied gasoline. It was a perverse image of the battle's reality. Nazi Germany's elite armor, the supposed pinnacle of Aryan technology, could only move forward by drinking the blood of the American industrial machine. Peiper took 50,000 gallons at Bullingen. It seemed like a fortune. But to a column of heavy armor, moving at combat speeds, 50,000 gallons was not a lifeline. It was merely a snack. It bought him hours, not days. As he looked at his maps toward the massive fuel depots deeper inland, Peiper realized the terrifying truth. He was winning the firefights, but he was losing the math. The road ahead was getting longer, and the logistics tail behind him was already severed. He was now a shark that had to keep swimming or die, chasing the scent of gasoline into the heart of the American lines. While Peiper hunted for fuel in the snow, the Allied command structure was undergoing a transformation that the German high command had deemed impossible. In Berlin, the planners assumed that the shock of the breakthrough would paralyze the American leadership for days. They believed the democratic decision-making process was too slow, too bureaucratic, to react to a blitzkrieg. They were wrong. They had mistaken the initial confusion of the frontline units for the paralysis of the system. At Supreme Headquarters, General Dwight D. Eisenhower looked at the map and did not see a disaster. He saw an opportunity. He realized that by rushing out of their fortifications, the Germans had stuck their neck into a noose. The question was not how to push them back, but how to cut them off. The American reaction was industrial in its speed. Within 24 hours, the Red Ball Express, the massive truck convoy system, supplying the front, reversed its flow. Instead of supplies moving forward, reinforcements were rushed laterally across the front. The 101st Airborne Division, resting in France, was loaded onto trucks and hurled toward the vital road junction of Bastogne. This was not a march, it was a logistical injection. The U.S. Army was moving entire cities of men at 40 miles per hour. But the real enemy of the German panzers in these critical hours was not the airborne troops. It was a handful of combat engineers. This was the engineers' war. The German King Tigers, for all their armor and firepower, suffered from a fatal flaw: obesity. At nearly 70 tons, they were too heavy for most rural bridges in the Ardennes. They were shackled to the main roads. The American engineers realized this immediately. They stopped trying to fight the tanks and started fighting the geography. Small teams of men from the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion, armed not with anti-tank guns but with crates of TNT, began a game of cat and mouse with Peiper's column. On December 18th, the dry trap began to snap shut at the town of Trois Ponts. Peiper needed the bridges there to access the open roads that led to the Meuse River. and the massive fuel dumps beyond. As his lead tanks approached the first bridge, the prize was visible. The road to victory lay just across the water. But mathematics intervened again. The American engineers blew the bridge right in Peiper's face. The explosion didn't just destroy a structure, it destroyed the German timeline. Peiper was forced to turn his massive column around, burning priceless gallons of fuel to find another crossing. He diverted toward the village of L'Église, unaware that he was driving into a geographical cul-de-sac. The frustration in the German command vehicles was palpable. They possessed the most powerful land weapons on Earth, yet they were being defeated by gravity and demolition charges. Every detour cost them hours. Every hour cost them fuel, and the fuel gauge was now entering the red zone. Meanwhile, the parasitic gamble was failing. The massive fuel depot near Stavelot, holding over 2 million gallons of gasoline, enough to power the drive to Antwerp, was agonizingly close. Peiper's men could practically smell the petrol. But the Americans, realizing the danger, did the unthinkable. They didn't just defend the fuel, they prepared to burn it. They poured thousands of gallons into a road cut and set it ablaze, creating a wall of fire. The irony was absolute. The German army was freezing and running out of gas, stopped by a wall of burning fuel that they desperately needed to steal. The dry trap was no longer a metaphor. It was a physical reality of fire and ice. Peiper was not being outfought. He was being starved in the midst of plenty. The momentum of the Blitzkrieg was bleeding out into the snow, drop by wasted drop. By December 20th, the geometric elegance of the German battle plan had collapsed into a chaotic squalor. The offensive was no longer a spear, it was a broken arrow. The critical failure point was now centered on the town of Bastogne. To the American public and the history books, Bastogne is remembered for the heroism of the 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles, who held the line against overwhelming odds. But to a German logistician, Bastogne was not a battle of courage. It was a catastrophic blockage in the circulatory system of the offensive. Bastogne was the hub of a wheel, where 7 vital hard-surface roads converged. In the mud and snow of the Ardennes, these roads were the arteries. Without them, the German supply trucks, the lifeblood carrying the fuel, were forced onto secondary dirt tracks that had been churned into swamps. By holding the town, the Americans didn't just surround themselves, they created a thrombus, a blood clot that stopped the flow of logistics to the German spearheads further west. While the panzers at the front were starving, the German rear areas were suffering from a lethal case of logistical constipation. The roads behind the front were gridlocked for miles. This revealed the schizophrenia of the German army in 1944. At the front, they had the futuristic King Tigers and jet aircraft, but supporting them was a logistics tale that belonged to the 19th century. 80% of the German army still relied on horses. In the narrow, icy ravines of the Ardennes, this mixture of eras was disastrous. Horse-drawn artillery caissons blocked fuel trucks. Broken-down Panther tanks blocked horse carts. The friction of the terrain was destroying the Wehrmacht's efficiency. A fuel truck might be only 10 miles away from a tank that needed it, but if there are 5,000 horses and a destroyed bridge in between, that fuel might as well be on the moon. Meanwhile, at the tip of the spear, in the village of L'Église, Joachim Peiper's war came to its mathematical conclusion. He had achieved the deepest penetration of the offensive. He had terrified the Allied command, but his fuel gauges now read 0. The parasitic strategy had failed. The captured American fuel was burned or out of reach, and his own supply lines were cut. On December 23rd, Peiper made a decision that symbolized the death of the Blitzkrieg. He ordered his men to destroy their equipment. The King Tigers, the Panthers, the half-tracks, the pinnacle of German engineering, were not destroyed by enemy fire. They were abandoned, intact, or blown up by their own crews. These 70-ton monsters had been defeated by an empty gas tank. Peiper and his remaining men walked out of L'Église on foot, trekking through the snow like common infantry, leaving their steel shells behind. It was the ultimate humiliation. The weapon system designed for speed and dominance had been rendered inert by simple resource starvation. But the final nail in the coffin was yet to come. The one variable that had protected the Germans, the Hitler weather, was about to change. On the morning of December 23rd, the grey skies over the Ardennes suddenly turned a brilliant, piercing blue. The high-pressure system had shifted, the fog lifted. For the German commanders looking up from their frozen command posts, that blue sky was not a sign of beauty, it was a death sentence. The dry trap on the ground was about to be joined by the hammer from the sky. The industrial might of the Allied air forces, grounded for a week, was starting its engines. The equation was about to add a new variable: total air supremacy. The slaughter was no longer just about logistics. It was about to become kinetic. When the sun broke through the clouds on December 23rd, the German army did not hear birds singing. They heard the sound of their own extinction. The roar of thousands of radial engines filled the air. To the German soldier, these were the jabos, the fighter bombers. To the Allied command, this was the tactical application of industrial supremacy. The sky above the Ardennes became a conveyor belt of destruction. P-47, Thunderbolts and Hawker Typhoons descended like birds of prey. These aircraft were not fighting a dogfight, they were conducting an execution. Their targets were not just the stranded King Tigers, but the thin, fragile umbilical cords of the German supply lines. The dry trap had stopped the tanks, but the air power ensured they would never move again. On the narrow, winding roads, the carnage was absolute. German columns, already gridlocked by their own logistical incompetence, were trapped in a shooting gallery. A single P-47 could strafe a column from end to end, turning fuel trucks into fireballs and horse-drawn carts into splinters. The roads became graveyards of burning equipment. The smoke from the destruction rose thousands of feet into the air, marking the location of the next target for the pilots circling above. For the German commanders, the psychological impact was devastating. They were witnessing the death of the concept of maneuver warfare. You cannot maneuver when you cannot move during the day. The German army was forced to become a creature of the night, hiding in the forests during daylight hours, listening to the sound of their logistics being dismantled piece by piece. The air campaign, known as interdiction, severed the final hope of the offensive. The rail lines bringing supplies from Germany were bombed into oblivion. The bridge at Euskirchen, a vital artery for the offensive, was dropped into the river. The mathematical equation had shifted from subtraction to division. The German army wasn't just losing fuel, they were being physically isolated from their source of power. General Patton's Third Army, which had performed a miraculous 90-degree turn to attack the southern flank of the Bulge, was now advancing with the support of this air armada. The Germans found themselves in a vice. To the south, Patton's armor was hammering against their flank. From the sky, the Jabos were hammering their supply lines, and in their fuel tanks, there was nothing but vapor. The dry trap had evolved into a death trap. The German panzer divisions, once the masters of the Blitzkrieg, were now static pillboxes made of steel. They were formidable if you stood in front of them, but they were helpless against an enemy that could fly over them and cut off their food and water. The offensive was no longer about reaching Antwerp. It was about survival. The Great Solution had shrunk to a desperate fight to keep a corridor open for retreat. In the command bunkers, the maps told the story of a dying organism. The arrows that had pointed so ambitiously toward the sea were now shrinking, curling back on themselves. The fuel crisis had forced a tactical implosion. Commanders were ordering their men to siphon fuel from 3 tanks to fill up 1, leaving 2 behind to be destroyed. They were cannibalizing their own army to buy a few more miles of movement, not to attack, but to escape. By December 26th, the geometry of the battlefield had shifted from a spearhead into a death trap. On the map, the German advance had created a deep protrusion into the Allied lines, the famous Bulge. To the propagandists in Berlin, this shape represented territory gained. But to a military strategist, a deep, narrow, salient with stagnant flanks is the most dangerous shape in warfare. It is a long, exposed neck waiting for the guillotine. The German offensive had stalled just short of the Meuse River. The zero-gallon reality meant they lacked the kinetic energy to punch through the final layer of defense. They were now sitting ducks in a frozen shooting gallery, and the Allied response was about to demonstrate the true difference between a resource-starved army and an industrial superpower. From the south, General George Patton delivered what is arguably the greatest logistical feat of the war. In under a week, he disengaged his Third Army from combat in the Saar, pivoted them 90 degrees, and drove them north into the flank of the German advance. This was not just a maneuver, it was a triumph of frictionless warfare. Patton moved over 100,000 men and vehicles on icy roads without losing cohesion. While German commanders were begging for single jerrycans of fuel, Patton's tanks were rolling with full reservoirs, followed by an endless river of supply trucks. On December 26th, Patton's 4th Armored Division broke through the encirclement at Bastogne. The blood clot in the German road network was surgically removed. The link-up didn't just relieve the 101st Airborne, it signaled the end of the German initiative. The hunters had officially become the hunted. Inside the pocket, the situation for the German soldier devolved into a primitive struggle for survival. The mighty panzer divisions, now immobile, were reduced to acting as fixed artillery. The infantry, deprived of armored support, were exposed to the full weight of American firepower. The dry trap had stripped the Wehrmacht of its greatest asset, mobility. A tank without fuel is just a bunker, and a bunker can be bypassed, surrounded, and destroyed at leisure. Hitler's refusal to allow a retreat turned the tactical defeat into a strategic slaughter. He ordered his generals to hold every inch of ground, ignoring the reality that they had no resources to hold it with. This order condemned the flower of the German military to a slow death in the snow. They were fighting to defend a shape on a map that had no strategic value, burning ammunition they couldn't replace, and bleeding manpower that Germany no longer possessed. The dry trap was now exacting its final price. It wasn't just costing the Germans tanks, it was costing them the last reserves of their veteran leadership. The NCOs, the junior officers, the men who had survived Russia and Normandy, they were being ground down in a static war of attrition that Germany mathematically could not win. The Blitzkrieg was dead, buried in the snowdrifts of the Ardennes. Not by enemy genius, but by an empty fuel tank. The retreat from the Ardennes was not a military maneuver, it was a funeral procession for the Wehrmacht's armored strength. As the German commanders attempted to pull their forces back toward the Siegfried Line, they discovered that the dry trap had one final, cruel twist. The same lack of fuel that had stopped their advance now made their escape impossible. The roads leading back to Germany converged at the town of Hufeleis. In military terms, this was a bottleneck. In practical terms, it was a slaughterhouse. With fuel tanks running on fumes, thousands of vehicles were funneled into this narrow corridor. The congestion was so dense that Allied pilots reported they didn't even need to aim. They simply dropped their ordnance into the mass of steel and flesh, guaranteed to hit something vital. This was the moment where the myth of the Aryan Superman collided with the reality of industrial asphyxiation. The elite SS troopers, men who had been marketed as the finest soldiers in the world, were reduced to scavenging boots from dead Americans because their logistics system could no longer provide footwear. They were trudging past their own wonder weapons, the King Tigers and Panthers, which sat silent and cold on the roadside. The landscape of the Ardennes became a surreal museum of abandoned technology. Allied recovery teams later found hundreds of German tanks that were in perfect mechanical condition. They had no battle damage. Their optics were calibrated, their ammunition racks were full. They had simply run dry. The crews had drained the last drops of petrol to destroy the engines with grenades and walked away. It is critical to understand the economic magnitude of this loss. A King Tiger tank cost hundreds of thousands of Reichsmarks and required thousands of man-hours of skilled labor to build. It was a masterpiece of engineering, and it was being defeated by a lack of synthetic fuel that cost pennies to produce. The German war economy was hemorrhaging its most expensive assets because it could not supply the cheapest commodity. Meanwhile, the Allied counteroffensive was closing the jaws of the trap. General Montgomery from the north and General Patton from the south were driving toward each other to link up at Hufeleis. The German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army were inside a shrinking pocket that was being compressed by artillery from all sides. The German command and control system began to fracture. Field Marshal Model, realizing the hopelessness of the situation, requested permission to withdraw to the Rhine to save the remaining manpower. Hitler refused. From his bunker hundreds of miles away, detached from reality, he demanded that the line be held. This order did not change the outcome, it merely increased the casualty count. The dry trap had done more than just stop an offensive. It had broken the psychological spine of the Western Front. The German soldier realized that no matter how well he fought, no matter how superior his tank was, he was part of a system that had already failed. He was fighting for a bankrupt corporation. The trust between the frontline soldier and the high command evaporated in the freezing fog of the retreat. They were no longer fighting for victory. They were fighting for the right to retreat to a border that they knew they could not hold. By mid-January 1945, the map of the Ardennes had returned to its original shape. The bulge was gone. The Americans had reclaimed the ground. But the German army that retreated back across the border was fundamentally different from the one that had attacked a month earlier. It had suffered a form of amputation. The strategic cost of the dry trap cannot be measured merely in the number of tanks lost, but in the specific type of loss. Germany had gambled its strategic reserve, the last coherent formations capable of mobile warfare, and lost them in a casino of snow and mud. The 6th Panzer Army, intended to be the elite sword of the Reich, had been blunted beyond repair. It was no longer an offensive weapon. It was a scrap heap of burned-out hulls scattered across Belgium. This loss created a catastrophic vacuum. While Hitler had obsessed over capturing a few fuel dumps in the west, he had stripped the eastern front of its armor. The dry trap in the Ardennes had effectively opened the door to Berlin for the Red Army. The Panther tanks that should have been waiting on the Vistula River to stop the Soviet steamroller were instead rusting in the Ardennes, victims of empty fuel tanks. The German High Command was now engaged in a delusion of ghost armies. On the situation maps in the Führer bunker, flags representing panzer divisions were still moved around with confidence, but in reality, these divisions were now administrative phantoms. They had names, numbers, and commanders, but they had no tracks, no fuel, and no combat power. The dry trap had forced the Wehrmacht into a state of strategic insolvency. The human cost was equally terminal. The Ardennes offensive had consumed the last generation of German veterans, the tank commanders who knew how to angle their armor, the infantry NCOs who knew how to coordinate with artillery. They were dead or captured. They were replaced by the Volkssturm, old men, and young boys, armed with Panzerfausts and bicycles. This was the moment when the German military machine ceased to be a professional modern army and devolved into a desperate militia. The intricate Kampfgruppe tactics that had conquered Europe require highly trained men and mobile machines. You cannot execute a Blitzkrieg with 16-year-olds on bicycles. The lesson of the dry trap was now clear to every surviving officer. Industrial warfare does not forgive romantic gambling. The belief that willpower could overcome a lack of gasoline was a lie that had cost Germany its last chance to negotiate a defensive stalemate. They had thrown their last chips on the table, and the Allied industrial complex, had swept them away. As the Allies prepared to breach the Siegfried Line and enter Germany proper, they were no longer facing a cohesive defense system. They were facing a hollow shell. The dry trap had done the work of a dozen major battles. It had disarmed Germany from the inside out, leaving it naked against the coming storm from both the east and the west. As the wreckage of the panzer divisions cooled in the snow of the Ardennes, a secondary, perhaps even more tragic consequence of the dry trap began to unfold in the skies over Germany. The fuel that had been wasted in the gamble for Antwerp was not just diesel for tanks. It was the lifeblood of the Third Reich's last hope, the Wunderwaffen, or wonder weapons. In early 1945, Germany possessed a technological marvel that was decades ahead of the Allies. The Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter. These sharks of the sky were flying 100 miles per hour faster than the American Mustangs. In the hands of a skilled pilot, the Me-262 was untouchable. It had the potential to tear apart the Allied bomber formations and perhaps stalemate the air war. But the dry trap had extended its reach from the mud of Belgium to the concrete runways of the Luftwaffe. The offensive had burned through the strategic fuel reserves that were critical for these jets. A jet engine is a thirsty beast. Without the synthetic fuel from the plants like Leuna, which were now being relentlessly pounded by Allied bombers, the Me-262 seconds were grounded. We witness here the ultimate paradox of the German war effort. They had built the car of the future, but they couldn't afford the gas to drive it. Allied reconnaissance photos from this period show a pathetic sight. The most advanced aircraft in human history being towed to the runway by oxen or horses to save taxiing fuel. They would sit on the tarmac, fully armed, waiting for fuel trucks that never arrived, until American fighters swooped down and destroyed them on the ground. The fuel shortage created a systemic rot that went deeper than just empty tanks. It destroyed the human software of the Luftwaffe. To train a fighter pilot requires hundreds of hours of flight time. That flight time requires thousands of gallons of fuel. Because of the dry trap, the Luftwaffe was forced to cut training programs to the bone. New pilots were sent into combat with only a fraction of the necessary experience. This led to a massacre. The German Air Force was no longer being defeated by superior enemy pilots, but by their own inability to practice. They had the hardware of 1,950 and the training logistics of a bankrupt flying club. In April 1945, the desperation reached its zenith with the formation of Sonderkommando Elbe. This was a unit dedicated to ramming Allied bombers. The shortage of fuel and trained pilots had reduced a sophisticated air force to using medieval tactics. They were asking young men to turn themselves into guided missiles because the industrial system could no longer provide them with the means to fight conventionally. The dry trap had effectively neutralized the entire German technological advantage. It proved that in a war of attrition, a perfect weapon is useless without the mundane, unglamorous supply chain to support it. The Ardennes offensive didn't just break the army. It starved the air force to death, leaving the German cities completely defenseless against the rain of fire from above. The roof of the fortress had been blown off, and the fuel needed to fix it had been spilled in the snow of Bastogne. When the snow finally melted in the spring of 1945, the Ardennes revealed the true scale of the catastrophe. It was an industrial graveyard stretching for miles. In the ditches and forests lay the rusting carcasses of nearly 600 German tanks and assault guns. These were not just machines, they were the last tangible assets of a bankrupt empire. The dry trap had delivered its final verdict. The Battle of the Bulge was not merely a tactical defeat, it was the definitive collision between two opposing philosophies of war. On one side was the Nazi belief in the triumph of the will, the romantic, irrational idea that spirit, fanaticism, and superior tactical skill could overcome material deficiencies. On the other side was the Allied doctrine of the triumph of the spreadsheet, the cold, hard logic of logistics, supply chains, and industrial redundancy. The wreckage left behind in Belgium proved that in modern warfare, the spreadsheet always wins. The German soldier had fought with undeniable ferocity and skill. The German engineers had built tanks that were, ton for ton, superior to anything the Allies possessed. But the system they served was broken. A King Tiger tank that cannot move is not a weapon. It is a monument to poor planning. The legacy of the dry trap is a lesson that echoes through military academies to this day. It demonstrated that a mediocre tank with a full gas tank is infinitely superior to a perfect tank with an empty one. It proved that amateurs talk about strategy, while professionals talk about logistics. By exhausting its final strategic reserves in a gamble that required a miracle to succeed, the German High Command had effectively disarmed themselves for the final defense of the fatherland. When the Allies crossed the Rhine weeks later, they did not meet a mobile, coherent defense. They met scattered units of walking infantry and boys on bicycles, guarding bridges that they had no fuel to blow up. The dry trap did not just starve an offensive, it starved the ideology itself. It exposed the lie at the heart of the Third Reich, that they were a master race destined to rule. The reality was that they were a resource-poor nation that had picked a fight with the entire industrialized world. As the Allied armies raced toward Berlin from the west, and the Soviet steamroller crushed in from the east, the Wehrmacht was no longer a functioning military entity. It was a disjointed collection of desperate men, dying to defend a regime that had sent them into battle with empty pockets. The final image of Hitler's last Blitzkrieg is not a picture of a roaring Tiger tank breaking through the American lines. It is the image of a young German tanker standing on a quiet road in Belgium, striking a match to burn his own vehicle because the needle on the dashboard pointed to zero. The war was not lost on the battlefield. It was lost at the gas pump. The trap had snapped shut, and for the 1,000-year Reich, the tank was finally empty.